In this video, we will discuss Michel Balaev's essay Trends in Literary Trauma Theory. Contemporary literary trauma theory suggests that when someone goes through a traumatic experience, it can leave them feeling speechless and scared, which can damage or even destroy their sense of who they are. This idea is used to argue that our sense of self is influenced by passing down of trauma from one generation to another. However, relying solely on one psychological theory about trauma leads to a narrow understanding of different ways trauma is shown in literature. This approach overlooks how language, experiences, memories, and places interact. Looking at the various ways trauma and memory are presented in literature, we see how places are used to symbolize the effects of trauma. Descriptions of where a traumatic event happened and where it's remembered show how it's linked to a larger cultural context. This context shapes how the event is remembered and how the person changes afterward. In novels, the disruption caused by trauma affects how people connect with others. It challenges their beliefs about right and wrong and how they relate to society. Novels describe the places of trauma in detail because these environments help us understand the characters' identities and the meaning of what they have been through. The importance of place in depicting trauma connects personal experiences to broader cultural settings, shaping how memories and meanings of trauma are organized. Trauma refers to how someone emotionally reacts when a really overwhelming event shakes up their sense of self and their understanding of society's rules. A trauma novel is a work of fiction that shows intense loss of fear on an individual or collective level. What defines these novels is the transformation of a person due to a powerful outside experience. This change highlights how they come to terms with new understandings of themselves and the world, often linked to memory dynamics. The intense event that triggers a strong reaction from the main character is not always tied to a big disaster like a war. It can be something very personal, like sexual violence or the sudden death of a loved one. The common trauma theory today relies on the idea that trauma creates a gap in time and a disruption of a person's sense of self. This means that recalling the trauma experience through storytelling becomes important. However, this theory also acknowledges that remembering trauma is always an imperfect version of the past due to the nature of traumatic experiences. This perspective views the responses to trauma like mental confusion and potential changes in consciousness as natural outcomes of such experiences. The notion that trauma can deeply divide a person's identity is used metaphorically by writers to explain how much it can damage a person's coherent sense of self and their mindset. Balaev refers to this trauma theory in literary analysis as the shattering trope. A widely held idea in literary studies suggests that trauma is beyond the reach of being represented through words. This creates a gap between traumatic experiences and how they are portrayed. This perspective, championed by scholars like Kathy Caruth, forms the foundation of the dominant theory of literary trauma. Caruth argues that trauma is not tied to a clear event from the past, but rather emerges from the way it was not initially understood and comes back to haunt the survivor later. According to this view, traumatic experiences are too difficult for the brain to process and encode properly. The origin of trauma is forever hidden, but its effects linger and intrude upon the person's thoughts. This theory proposes that trauma is only known through repetitive flashbacks that relieve the event because the mind can't handle it in any other way. Trauma is seen as a constant and timeless negative memory stored in an unreachable place in the brain, ready to interrupt thoughts and be passed on to others who have not experienced it. Carruth's ideas about trauma and memory, largely influenced by Freud, have greatly shaped the study of literary trauma, especially when dealing with historical trauma. Carruth's theory suggests that traumatic experiences are repeated, timeless, unspeakable, yet also literal, contagious, and fixed. Carruth states that the experience of trauma keeps repeating itself through the person's actions even if they are unaware of it. This perspective likens external events to infectious agents that harm an individual. While the experience is stored in the brain, it has the potential to affect others through narration or shared backgrounds. Carruth suggests that trauma is not just personal but also spreads across people's experiences, leading to the idea that trauma can be transmitted across generations through shared characteristics, creating a post traumatic culture. This view of trauma as timeless, repetitive, and contagious supports the idea that a massive historical trauma experienced by a group can affect an individual who shares similarities with that group, even if the event happened centuries ago. Similarly, an individual's trauma can be shared by others in the same group due to shared characteristics. This nature to the belief that trauma theories can allow readers, listeners, or witnesses to experience historical events as if they were there. However, this theory of intergenerational trauma blurs the line between personal experiences and historical absence. Personal loss is an individual's direct experience of traumatic event, while historical absence refers to a documented losses in one's ancestral lineage. This theory mixes up these distinctions, suggesting that an individual's contemporary identity can be affected by reading about historical events or having a shared ancestry. This can make it difficult to differentiate between those who experienced the trauma and those who did not. The idea about trauma experienced by individuals compared to that experienced by groups plays a big role in discussions about identity formation, especially regarding racial identity. This theory suggests that the concept of sharing loss and suffering across generations creates a fixed identity around common attributes like race, ethnicity, religion, or gender. For instance, historical events like slavery left a lack of rights for descendants, and this absence is seen as a shared experience that shapes the identity of that racial group. An example of this theory is found in J.B. Boson's book, Quiet as It's Kept: Shame, Trauma, and Race in the Novels of Toni Morrison. The book argues that slavery and racism over history have led to a cultural shame in contemporary black identity. This shame is seen as part of the collective African American experience shown in Morrison's novels and in American culture overall. The idea of trauma being passed down between generations offers an interesting way to look at trauma in literature and how it affects society. However, this way of thinking sometimes oversimplifies the various ways people respond to trauma and how memory and identity work in stories. This suggests a cause and effect link between individuals and groups and between experience and psychological issues, but it misses a key role that trauma plays in literature. In fiction, trauma is often shown through a protagonist who represents not only their personal trauma but also an event experienced by a larger group of people, either historically or in imagined scenarios. This can help raise awareness about events like slavery, wars, or natural disasters. However, it is important to understand that not everyone from the same group experienced trauma, and it is not the only thing that defines their identity. It is widely accepted that people respond to trauma differently depending on the cultural context and personal feelings around it. Since individuals are shaped by both their culture and their unique tendencies, trauma's meaning lies between the personal and societal aspects. In trauma novels, individual experiences of trauma often move between private and public meanings and personal and political influences. The protagonist in these novels plays a crucial role in illustrating how trauma and its memory are linked to a specific culture and place. Trauma is tied to personal and political identities, so the experiences of the characters are often shaped by larger cultural forces. For instance, a character might see their trauma as a result of war and also a larger cosmic cycle. This complexity means that the protagonist holds multiple meanings on various levels. Understanding that the traumatized protagonist both expresses a unique response to trauma and symbolizes a larger group does not mean that the character enforces an essential generational identity based on a past event. Novels show how an experience disrupts an individual's sense of self and connections to others, but the meaning of that experience is shaped by the cultural values within the story. While experts disagree on how extreme experiences affect memory and identity, they generally agree that trauma can alter these aspects. However, the extent of this alteration is influenced by cultural values and the storytelling methods tied to a specific place. The ability to talk about traumatic experiences is guided by cultural models and values that highlight what is important to remember. This perspective reminds us that the unspeakable nature of trauma is not necessarily due to inherent difficulties, but is often a result of cultural norms and ideologies. In considering the various roles of the traumatized main character, we can offer an alternative analysis to that of Bosen's regarding the representation of violence and suffering in Toni Morrison's novels. For instance, in Beloved, Morrison portrays the life of African Americans after 1865 in Ohio through the trauma of the main character, Seth. Seth's experiences highlight the damaging effects of slavery in America and the immense suffering of Africans and African Americans. This representation draws on historical narratives of violence, enslavement, and resistance from American slave narratives. The trauma experienced by female characters in Beloved relates to the suffering endured by enslaved African and African American women. Harriet Jacobs, who wrote under the name Linda Brent, shares experiences of abuse and rape by her slave master, similar to the main character's trauma in Morrison's novel. Jacobs mentions how she struggles to tell her grandmother about these violations. This shows that she uses silence and ambiguity to convey what is important and what should be left unsaid based on societal norms and narrative conventions. By withholding explicit details, the writer creates suspense and repulsion, allowing readers to imagine the horrors themselves. This emphasizes the effects of slavery on the human body and psyche, as well as the strength and resilience of enslaved African Americans. Morrison's protagonist is emotionally debilitated and even psychotic at times, but eventually recovers with the help of her community. This character draws from the historical figure Margaret Garner, who escaped enslavement and killed her own child to prevent their enslavement. The personal experience of Morrison's character resonates with a larger population of forcibly enslaved Africans. The main character connects personal and collective experiences, but the leap to claim this produces a traumatized collective African American identity relying on intergenerational model of trauma and memory. Boson argues that contemporary racial identity is defined by the woundedness of African American life. This idea fits into a long history of debates among African American scholars and artists about representing African American life as either traumatized and dislocated or as a well functioning culture with resilience. So, in addition to Boson's perspective, Morrison's protagonists can be seen as embodying the strength of human psyche that prevails against traumatic experiences and moves beyond an identity solely defined by a past traumatic event. The concluding line of Morrison's novel, "This is not a story to pass on," can be interpreted in different ways regarding how personal and collective traumatic experiences are remembered by individuals and society. Rather than implying that trauma is solely a neural hormonal phenomenon with a genetic imprint, this line suggests that the story's meaning changes based on historical time and place. It implies that significant lessons can be learned and passed between generations through storytelling about loss and suffering. The intentionally ambiguous ending confirms that multiple meanings of trauma and memory persist in literary representations. The trauma novel uses various storytelling techniques to convey intense emotions. These include using landscape descriptions, nonlinear plots, silence, and omitting graphic details of trauma. These methods help authors show mental turmoil, confusion, and contemplation in response to trauma. The use of silence or omission creates a gap that lets readers imagine what might have happened to the main character, adding depth to the experience. While some see these silences as supporting neural hormonal theories, they are also strategies conveying different meanings of trauma in fiction. These techniques structure the narrative to reflect the psychological impact of traumatic theory. Considering the significance of place, especially how landscape imagery is used, offers a new perspective on trauma's meaning for individuals and communities. Place refers to a physical environment where a person attaches meaning. It is also where personal and cultural realities intersect, shaping memories and identity. Place is not just a location, it is tied to perception, organizing experiences, and feelings. Understanding place as a character in a novel means recognizing that identity is connected to relationships with both the self and surroundings. This view shifts how we see protagonists' identity is in relation to place, highlighting the dynamic between the self, non self, and the human and non human. Modern trauma novels often explore how suffering affects individuals and communities in relation to place. Trauma disrupts the connection between self and others by challenging moral and social norms linked to specific environments. Novels describe the place of trauma to explore personal and cultural histories embedded in landscapes that define the character's identity. Place influences how traumatic experiences are understood. This approach grounds the individual experience in a larger cultural context, as place's significance is shaped by individual perception and cultural meaning. Authors place traumatic events in cultural contexts that influence the experience's meaning and memory. Using a specific place highlights that trauma is culturally specific. Its meaning depends on historical moments and identity attributes like race or gender. Authors describe cultural practices that attach meaning to locations, making them symbolic for the protagonist. Place as a symbol reflects cultural values and perceptions invested in it. This adds layers to trauma's meaning for both the character and culture. For example, in Lan Cao's novel, the significance of place is seen when Than's traumatic experience of the Vietnam War converges with family and political conflicts. The meaning of Than's trauma is conveyed through the Earth's response to bombing, reflecting the violence inflicted on her body. Her experience shapes her sense of self and life's meaning afterward. This approach emphasizes how cultural beliefs influence identity understanding and how trauma alters the self and perception of the world. It offers a perspective beyond a neurobiological view that confines trauma's impact with an individual's mind, ignoring its cultural dimension. In the trauma novel, the physical place where suffering occurs becomes crucial for expressing the various meanings of the event. The landscape holds significance for the character's identity. Authors often focus on the natural world where the protagonist confronts a traumatic memory, showcasing their internal struggle as they try to understand and process the experience. After the trauma, the natural surroundings become a testing ground for the protagonist's sense of self and reality. Different models of memory and dissociation in trauma novels challenge the idea that trauma is unspeakable. Authors depict intense emotions and ways traumatic experiences reshape perceptions and values. In novels like Black Sun, Beloved, or Ceremony, silence is achieved through gaps in time or space, reflecting the disjointed states of consciousness. This silence is not evidence of trauma's void, but a rhetorical tool. Rather than simple view of identity formation, the trauma novel presents a theory that the protagonist's perception of self before and after trauma depends on the event's nature and where it happens. This highlights culturally informed narrative structures for expressing the experience. The meaning of trauma often changes when the protagonist recalls it for different people. In Ceremony, for instance, the protagonist's understanding of his traumatic past varies based on his audience. The traumatized protagonist might experience a sense of self estrangement instead of a shattered identity. Trauma rearranges the previous reality, and the protagonist must redefine themselves in relation to this new understanding. This is not always a negative process. Characters sometimes find relief and growth. The trauma novel shows that the reorganized self is linked to a specific place, which shapes the transformed identity. This identity is fluid and connected to surroundings, not solely tied to traumatic event. Trauma novels depict a range of trauma imagery, emphasizing the diversity of responses and consciousness forms. They don't uniformly show trauma as timeless or repetitive, but as an experience that affects perception in various ways. Traumatic events challenge the character's view of reality based on moral truths developed in the novel. The traumatized protagonist often adapts to this new reality, not just shattering into pieces. The claim that trauma shatters identity is different from how trauma events are portrayed in narratives. Shattering implies an absolute break of knowledge. Trauma does disrupt the self and the world, but it often leads to adaptive changes in perception due to violent events caused by individuals or society. The trauma novel provides its own perspective, challenging mainstream psychological theories and showcasing the impact of trauma through various cultural viewpoints. In novels like Ceremony, the protagonist's recovery involves understanding his experience beyond a simple diagnosis like PTSD, embracing a more complex understanding. The trauma novel challenges the idea that traumatic memories are frozen and separate from normal ones. Traumatic memory is often portrayed as changing and evolving, with each retelling reflecting how memories are actively rearranged based on individual needs. In novels like Black Sun and Melee, memories are molded and changed when recalled. The trauma novel shows that the talking cure, or just talking, about the trauma is not always the solution. Healing can happen through actions like connecting with nature. In ceremony, the protagonist recovers through individuals and interactions with the land before being able to talk about trauma. The trauma novel explores how trauma triggers a deep state of inquiry where the meaning of the experience and one's understanding of self and the world are intensely examined. This process of questioning and re evaluating personal and social knowledge is central to the plot. Trauma often causes the protagonist to turn inward, struggling with the past while becoming more aware of the external world. This process is tied to place, connecting personal experiences with broader cultural context. Place's significance in the trauma novel is crucial for discussing the impact of trauma in literature. Descriptions of where trauma occurs, where recovery happens, and where traumatic memories resurface bring attention to the broader influences that shape memory and self. Looking at trauma in literature from a wider perspective goes beyond a single psychological model, offering a rich understanding of the varied meanings of traumatic experiences for individuals and society.